I dare you to find a mistake. The words echoed across the executive conference hall, followed immediately by scattered laughter. More executives smiled. Several investors exchanged amused glances. At the far end of the room, Daniel Harper remained seated, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. He did not respond. He did not defend himself. He simply looked back at the enormous financial projection displayed on the screen behind Victoria Grant. The numbers stretched across 3 walls of the conference center. Growth forecasts, acquisition targets, revenue projections, market expansion plans. The presentation represented the future of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. Hundreds of millions of dollars depended on those numbers being correct. Victoria stood confidently beneath the spotlight. She was exactly the kind of leader people expected to succeed. Intelligent, charismatic, fearless. Investors admired her. Financial analysts quoted her. Business magazines featured her on their covers. Standing beside her, senior executives smiled proudly as applause rolled through the room. Then Victoria pointed toward Daniel. Mr. Harper has spent the last 20 minutes studying our projections. More people turned toward him. Apparently, he has concerns. Additional laughter followed. Daniel folded his hands quietly. The conference hall felt warm beneath the bright lights. Rows of polished tables reflected the giant presentation screens. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretched toward the evening sky. Inside, nearly every person in the room appeared confident. Nearly every person except Daniel. Not because he was nervous, because he was uncertain about something far more important. A number. Victoria smiled. Go ahead. She gestured toward the screen. Tell us what everyone else missed. Several investors chuckled. One executive leaned back in his chair. Another checked his phone. Nobody seemed worried. Daniel slowly stood. I am not saying anyone missed something. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Then what are you saying? Daniel glanced back toward the projection. I am saying I would like to review one assumption more carefully. The room grew quieter, though only slightly. Victoria crossed her arms. That assumption was reviewed by 3 consulting firms. Daniel nodded. I understand. And verified by our board. I understand that too. Victoria smiled again. Then perhaps you should trust the experts. More laughter. Daniel remained perfectly calm. The reaction did not bother him. It never had. Years earlier, he might have argued. Years earlier, he might have felt the need to prove himself. Life had taught him something different. Truth did not become stronger because someone raised their voice. It remained true whether people believed it or not. Maybe I am wrong, Daniel said quietly. Then again, maybe the number deserves another look. Victoria spread her hands dramatically. I dare you. The room erupted with laughter once more. Daniel simply sat back down. The presentation continued. Executives discussed expansion strategies. Analysts projected future growth. Investors celebrated what appeared to be a remarkable opportunity. Yet throughout the next hour, Daniel's attention kept returning to the same figure displayed near the bottom corner of the projection. Most people would never notice it. Most people would not even think about it twice. Daniel could not stop thinking about it. Because something felt wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just enough to create a quiet discomfort in the back of his mind. The kind of feeling that had followed him throughout his career whenever a system failed to behave the way it should. After the meeting ended, people gathered around Victoria offering congratulations. Photographers snapped pictures. Reporters requested interviews. Daniel slipped quietly toward the exit. Nobody stopped him. Nobody asked for his opinion. That suited him perfectly. Outside, cool evening air drifted through the streets as he walked toward his aging pickup truck. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared from his 13-year-old daughter. Emma, are you done yet, Dad? Daniel smiled immediately. Almost. Want pizza tonight? Her reply arrived seconds later. Always. The smile remained as he started the truck. The conference disappeared behind him. The city lights blurred across the windshield. Yet even as he drove toward home, the same number stayed fixed in his thoughts. The same projection. The same assumption. The same tiny detail hidden beneath hundreds of pages of financial analysis. Somewhere inside those numbers, something did not belong. And for reasons he could not yet explain, Daniel Harper had a feeling that everyone in that conference hall was celebrating far too early. By the time Daniel Harper pulled into the driveway, the sun had already disappeared below the horizon. Warm light glowed from the kitchen window. It was his favorite sight at the end of any day. No matter how complicated the world became, that light always meant the same thing. Home. He stepped through the front door, carrying a small pizza box beneath one arm. Almost immediately, Emma appeared from the living room. "You are late." Daniel smiled. "I brought pizza." Emma crossed her arms dramatically. "You are forgiven." Daniel laughed softly. The tension from the conference seemed to fade the moment he saw her smile. They settled at the kitchen table, while evenings settled quietly around the house. Emma talked about school projects, teachers, friends, a science competition she wanted to enter next month. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions whenever she paused for breath. Anyone watching would see nothing extraordinary, just a father and daughter sharing dinner. And that was exactly how Daniel liked it. "How was your meeting?" Emma finally asked. Daniel took a sip of water. "Interesting." Emma narrowed her eyes. "That usually means something happened." "Maybe. Did somebody argue with you again?" Daniel smiled. "Not exactly." Emma laughed. "That means yes." Daniel shook his head. "It was a business discussion. And some people were very confident." Emma pointed a slice of pizza toward him. "That definitely means yes." They both laughed. The conversation moved on. Yet even while discussing homework and weekend plans, Daniel's mind occasionally drifted back to the presentation. The same number, the same assumption, the same uneasy feeling. Later that evening, after Emma headed upstairs to finish studying, Daniel carried a laptop into the small office beside the kitchen. The room was simple. A desk, a bookshelf, family photographs. Nothing impressive. Yet for years it had served as the place where he solved problems nobody else noticed. He opened the financial presentation and began reviewing the projections again, line by line, spreadsheet by spreadsheet. The house remained quiet around him. Outside, a light rain began tapping softly against the windows. Hours passed. Most people would have stopped long ago. Daniel continued. He had learned something during his years in financial systems analysis. Large failures rarely announce themselves. They hide inside tiny assumptions. Small mistakes. Numbers that appear harmless until someone follows them far enough. Near midnight, Daniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. Something was there. He could feel it. The problem was not obvious. The formulas worked. The reports matched. The forecasts aligned. Yet one variable seemed disconnected from reality. He reopened another file. Then another. Slowly, pieces began moving into place. Meanwhile, several miles away in the city, Victoria Grant stood before a group of investors celebrating the success of the presentation. Confidence filled the room. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed easily. Everyone spoke about future growth, market dominance, expansion opportunities. Nobody questioned the numbers. Why would they? 3 consulting firms had approved them. Multiple executives had reviewed them. The board had endorsed them unanimously. To everyone else, the discussion was finished. To Daniel, it had barely begun. Back at home, he continued working until nearly 1 o'clock in the morning. Eventually, he noticed a shadow standing in the office doorway. Emma. She rubbed her eyes sleepily. "Dad." Daniel looked up. "You should be asleep." "You should too." Daniel smiled. "Fair point." Emma glanced at the spreadsheets covering the screen. "Still thinking about that meeting?" Daniel hesitated. "A little." Emma stepped into the room. "You think something is wrong?" It was not a question. Daniel looked at the screen. "Maybe." "How wrong?" He considered the question carefully. "I do not know yet." Emma nodded. Then she surprised him. "You usually know." Daniel laughed softly. "Thanks for the pressure." Emma grinned. "I am serious." She pointed toward the screen. "Every time you get that look, somebody finds a mistake." Daniel looked back at the numbers. The rain continued falling outside. The clock ticked quietly on the wall. Somewhere deep inside the presentation, hidden beneath thousands of calculations and projections, a flaw waited to be discovered. And for reasons he still could not explain, Daniel was becoming increasingly certain that the flaw was much larger than anyone realized. Daniel Harper slept barely 4 hours. By 6 o'clock the next morning, he was already back at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cooling beside his laptop. The rain had stopped overnight. Pale sunlight filtered through the windows as the town slowly woke around him. Most people would have forgotten about the presentation by now. Most people would have moved on to other concerns. Daniel could not. The number remained exactly where he left it. Quiet. Unremarkable. Hidden inside hundreds of pages of financial forecasts. Yet the more he studied it, the more uncomfortable he became. Emma entered the kitchen wearing a school sweatshirt and carrying a textbook. She stopped when she noticed the spreadsheets covering the screen. "You never stopped, did you?" Daniel smiled tiredly. "Not exactly." Emma sat beside him. "Did you find something?" Daniel hesitated. "Maybe. That sounds like progress." He nodded slowly. "The problem is that I do not know if it is a mistake or an assumption." Emma frowned. "What is the difference?" Daniel leaned back. "A mistake is easy to fix. An assumption can affect everything built on top of it." Emma looked at the rows of numbers. "That sounds worse." Daniel smiled. "Much worse." After dropping Emma at school, he returned home instead of heading into the city. He opened additional reports connected to the company's expansion plan, public filings, market analyses, investor documents. One by one, he compared them against the presentation. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. The coffee grew cold again. Then shortly after 11 o'clock, Daniel froze. He stared at a section of data buried deep inside a supporting report. His eyes moved back and forth between two columns. Then 3. Then 4. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The room became completely silent. "No," he whispered. He checked the numbers again. Then again. The result remained the same. Daniel stood and paced across the room. The flaw was real. More importantly, it was not located where everyone expected. The growth projections themselves were not the problem. The revenue forecasts were not the problem. The problem sat beneath them, hidden inside a market valuation assumption that had been repeated across dozens of models. One small error, one incorrect multiplier, one figure accepted without challenge because every subsequent report trusted the one before it. Daniel returned to his desk. His pulse quickened slightly, not from excitement, from concern. Because if he was correct, the consequences stretched far beyond a simple accounting issue. Entire investment decisions rested on those forecasts. Acquisition strategies depended on them. Board approvals depended on them. Confidence depended on them. He opened another spreadsheet and began rebuilding the calculations from the ground up. Every formula, every variable, every assumption. The process took hours. By mid-afternoon, sunlight filled the room. Yet Daniel barely noticed. The numbers told a story now, a story nobody else seemed to have read. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. Daniel answered to find an old colleague standing on the porch. Mark Reynolds. They had worked together years earlier. "I heard about the conference," Mark said with a grin. Daniel laughed softly. "News travels fast." Mark stepped inside. "Apparently you challenged a room full of executives." "Not exactly. That is not what people are saying." Daniel shook his head. "People enjoy dramatic versions of simple events." Mark noticed the spreadsheets covering the dining table. "Still working on it." Daniel nodded. Mark walked closer and studied the screen. His smile slowly disappeared. "Hold on." Daniel remained silent. Mark reviewed several calculations. Then another page. Then another. "Daniel." His voice had changed. "Tell me this is not what I think it is." Daniel looked at him. "I wish I could." Mark lowered himself into a chair. "How many people have seen this?" "Only you." Mark stared at the figures again. "If these assumptions are wrong." He never finished the sentence. He did not need to. Both men understood. The potential impact stretched into hundreds of millions of dollars. The room felt strangely quiet. Outside, children played somewhere down the street. Cars passed. Ordinary life continued. Yet inside the house, a very different reality had emerged. Daniel finally closed the spreadsheet and exhaled slowly. The uncertainty was gone now. The flaw existed. The numbers proved it. The only question remaining was whether anyone would listen before it became impossible to ignore. And as the afternoon sunlight drifted across the table, Daniel realized he was no longer looking at a questionable projection. He was looking at the beginning of a $600 million problem. The discovery changed everything for Daniel Harper, but only inside his own mind. Outside, the world continued exactly as before. Investors remained confident. Executives celebrated expansion plans. News outlets praised the company's future. Nobody knew that a single flawed assumption sat quietly beneath the foundation of it all. The following morning, Daniel reviewed the calculations one final time. He checked every formula, every data source, every supporting document. The conclusion never changed. The error was real. More importantly, it was growing. The longer nobody noticed it, the more expensive it would become. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before making a decision. He opened a new email. The message was professional, concise, respectful. He explained the issue. He attached supporting calculations. He highlighted the specific assumption creating the distortion. Then he sent copies to Victoria Grant, the chief financial officer, and several members of the executive review team. No accusations. No dramatic language. Just facts. Then he closed the laptop and drove Emma to school. You sent it? Emma asked from the passenger seat. Daniel smiled. I did. And now? Now we wait. Emma nodded thoughtfully. You hate waiting. Daniel laughed. Very much. The day passed quietly. No phone calls arrived. No emails appeared. No responses came from anyone connected to the company. Daniel spent the afternoon doing consulting work for several small businesses and tried to focus on other problems. Yet every few hours he checked his inbox. Nothing. By evening, the silence felt louder than before. The next morning brought the first response. Unfortunately, it was not the response he expected. Daniel opened the email while drinking coffee at the kitchen table. The message contained only a few sentences. Thank you for your observations. Our projections have already undergone extensive review by multiple independent organizations. We remain fully confident in our analysis. Daniel read it twice. Then he smiled faintly. Emma noticed immediately. That does not look like a good smile. Daniel turned the laptop toward her. She read the message. They ignored you. Daniel nodded. Essentially. Emma frowned. Did they even look? Daniel closed the screen. I do not know. The truth was that he suspected exactly what had happened. Someone had seen an outside consultant questioning approved projections and dismissed the concern without investigating further. It was easier that way. Easier to trust existing conclusions. Easier to believe a problem could not exist. Later that afternoon, Daniel received a phone call from Mark Reynolds. I heard back from someone inside the company, Mark said. Daniel leaned back in his chair. And? Mark sighed. They think you are overreacting. Daniel remained silent. Mark continued. One executive apparently said 3 consulting firms cannot all be wrong. Daniel looked out the office window. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Children rode bicycles. Neighbors watered lawns. Ordinary life continued. That is unfortunate, he said. Mark laughed bitterly. That is all you have to say? What else should I say? You should be frustrated. Daniel smiled. Being frustrated will not change the numbers. Mark could not argue with that. Meanwhile, inside the company's headquarters, Victoria Grant sat reviewing expansion schedules when one of her executives mentioned Daniel's email. The room reacted immediately. Several people rolled their eyes. Others dismissed the concern without discussion. Victoria listened quietly. Then she remembered the conference. The calm expression. The lack of ego. The way Daniel never argued, even when challenged publicly. Did anyone verify his calculations? She asked. The room grew slightly uncomfortable. One executive cleared his throat. The models have already been verified. Victoria repeated the question. Did anyone verify his calculations? Silence answered her. Finally, someone admitted. Not specifically. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Something about that bothered her. She had built her career on confidence. But confidence without verification was simply assumption. Across town, Daniel received another message near sunset. This one was different. The company board had scheduled a special review session for the following week. Daniel was invited to attend. No explanation accompanied the invitation. No indication of what had changed. Just a date, a time, and a conference room number. Emma read the message over his shoulder. That sounds important. Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe. Do you think they finally listened? Daniel looked at the calculations still open on the screen. The numbers had not changed. The flaw had not disappeared. The truth remained exactly where he found it. I think, he said quietly, they are finally willing to look. And for the first time since the conference, Daniel had the feeling that the silence surrounding the $600 million mistake was beginning to crack. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. For days during which Daniel Harper did everything possible not to think about it. Unfortunately, the human mind rarely cooperates with such plans. Every time he reviewed a client report, his thoughts drifted back to the same spreadsheets. Every time he sat down for dinner, he wondered whether anyone inside the company had finally examined the calculations properly. Yet despite the uncertainty, his daily routine remained unchanged. Emma still needed rides to school. Bills still needed paying. Clients still needed advice. Life continued moving forward. On Saturday afternoon, Emma found him trimming hedges in the front yard. You are pretending not to be nervous. Daniel laughed. Is it that obvious? Emma nodded. Very. He leaned on the handle of the trimmer. I am not nervous about being wrong. Then what are you nervous about? Daniel looked toward the quiet street. I am nervous about being right. Emma understood immediately. If the numbers were correct, the consequences would affect far more than a single presentation. Investors, employees, retirement funds, expansion projects. Thousands of decisions rested on those assumptions. The possibility weighed heavily on him. Monday arrived beneath clear blue skies. Daniel drove into the city before sunrise. The headquarters tower rose above the downtown skyline, reflecting morning light across glass and steel. Employees streamed through the entrance carrying coffee and laptops. Most had no idea what would be discussed that morning. Daniel entered quietly and checked in with security. A conference coordinator escorted him to the executive floor. The atmosphere felt different from the previous presentation. Less celebration, more caution. Inside the boardroom, several directors were already seated around a polished table. Financial analysts reviewed documents. Legal advisors occupied seats near the back. Large screens displayed charts and projections. Victoria Grant stood near one of the windows speaking with the chief financial officer. When she noticed Daniel entering, she walked over. Thank you for coming. Daniel smiled politely. Thank you for inviting me. Victoria studied him for a moment. You seem remarkably calm. Daniel glanced toward the spreadsheets displayed on the screens. The numbers are the same whether I worry or not. Victoria almost smiled. Fair point. As the meeting began, board members reviewed the original projections. Consultants presented summaries. Executives defended assumptions. Everything sounded confident. Everything sounded polished. Yet Daniel noticed something important. Nobody addressed the specific issue he identified. Not directly. Not yet. Nearly 2 hours passed. Finally, one board member turned toward him. Mr. Harper. The room grew quiet. You requested this review. Please explain your concern. Dozens of eyes focused on him. Daniel stood slowly and walked toward the presentation screen. The atmosphere reminded him of the earlier conference. The same attention, the same skepticism, the same confidence filling the room. Only this time, nobody laughed. Daniel connected his laptop and displayed a simple spreadsheet. No dramatic graphics. No elaborate presentation. Just numbers. The issue is not the revenue forecast, he began. Several executives exchanged glances. It is not the acquisition strategy. More silence followed. Daniel pointed toward a specific line item. The issue begins here. He highlighted a market valuation multiplier buried deep within the model. Several analysts leaned forward. Others opened copies of the report. Daniel continued calmly. This assumption was accepted during the initial analysis. Every subsequent model inherited it. The chief financial officer frowned. That figure was independently verified. Daniel nodded. That is what everyone believed. The room became noticeably quieter. Board members started reviewing documents more carefully. Analysts typed rapidly into laptops. Victoria watched without interruption. For the first time since the original conference, nobody seemed interested in defending assumptions. They were starting to investigate them. One analyst suddenly raised a hand. Hold on. His voice cut through the room. Everyone looked toward him. He stared at his screen for several seconds. Then he checked another document. Then another. The color slowly drained from his face. Nobody spoke. The room waited. Finally, he looked up. The source data does not match the multiplier. Silence followed. Not confusion. Not disagreement. Silence. Because for the first time, someone other than Daniel had found the same crack hidden beneath the foundation. And as more analysts began checking their own calculations, the uneasy feeling spreading through the boardroom suggested the problem might be even larger than anyone imagined. The boardroom remained silent long after the analyst spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air. The source data does not match the multiplier. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody laughed. Nobody dismissed the concern. For the first time since Daniel Harper entered the building, the confidence that had filled the room began to fade. Analysts opened additional files. Executives exchanged uneasy glances. Board members leaned forward in their chairs. Daniel remained standing beside the presentation screen. Calm, patient, quiet. He had seen moments like this before. The exact instant when certainty begins transforming into doubt. One analyst reviewed another report. Then another. A second analyst started rebuilding portions of the financial model from the original source documents. A third checked supporting assumptions used by outside consultants. Within minutes, the room became filled with the sound of keyboards and whispered calculations. Victoria Grant stood near the center of the table watching everything unfold. Her expression remained professional, but something had changed. The confidence was still there. The certainty was not. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Nobody seemed interested in taking a break. The deeper they looked, the more inconsistencies they found. Not because multiple mistakes existed, because one mistake had quietly multiplied through every layer of analysis. A senior financial advisor finally looked up from his screen. This changes the acquisition valuation. Nobody responded immediately. Another analyst spoke. It affects projected returns. A third voice followed. It affects debt assumptions too. The room grew quieter with each discovery. Daniel watched without satisfaction. There was nothing enjoyable about being right under circumstances like these. Every corrected figure revealed another consequence. Every consequence revealed another risk. Victoria slowly approached the main display. Show me the original assumption. The chief financial officer pulled up the source document. Several pages appeared on the screen. Lines of data stretched across multiple reports. Then one highlighted section appeared. The room focused on it immediately. Daniel recognized it at once. The same figure that had captured his attention days earlier. The same number that refused to leave his thoughts. Victoria studied it carefully. How did this happen? Nobody answered. Finally, one consultant cleared his throat. It appears an outdated market multiplier was imported during an early valuation review. Another consultant shook his head, and every subsequent model inherited it. Silence followed again. This time it felt heavier, because everyone understood what that meant. The error was not recent. It had existed from the beginning. Daniel quietly returned to his seat while the board continued examining the evidence. Nobody paid much attention to him now. The room had become consumed by the truth itself. Ironically, that was exactly how Daniel preferred it. He never wanted recognition. He wanted accuracy. Nearly an hour later, the lead analyst connected a revised projection to the main screen. New figures appeared. New forecasts. New valuations. The room stared at them. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then the analyst finally turned toward the board. Based on current calculations, the exposure exceeds $600 million. The number landed like a stone. $600 million. Not lost money. Not missing money. Potential exposure created by decisions built upon a flawed assumption. Yet the scale alone was enough to leave the room speechless. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others simply stared at the screen. Victoria looked toward Daniel. For a brief moment, neither person spoke. She remembered the conference, the public challenge, the laughter, the confidence, the dare. Daniel remembered it too. Yet his expression contained no resentment, no triumph, only the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning. The board chairman finally broke the silence. Mr. Harper. Daniel looked up. Yes. The chairman folded his hands carefully. When did you first identify the issue? The evening after the presentation. Several people shifted uncomfortably. The chairman continued. And you attempted to notify us immediately? Daniel nodded. Yes. More silence. Across the table, Victoria slowly sat down. For perhaps the first time in her career, she found herself reflecting not on a mistake in the numbers, but on a mistake in judgment. The room continued discussing corrective actions, revised timelines, and recovery strategies. Yet beneath every conversation remained the same undeniable fact. One person had seen the problem. One person had spoken up. One person had refused to ignore what everyone else overlooked. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the conference room windows, the atmosphere no longer resembled the confident meeting Daniel had attended days earlier. The laughter was gone. The assumptions were gone. Only the truth remained. And for the first time since this began, everyone in the room was finally looking directly at it. When the meeting finally ended, nobody rushed toward the exits. People remained seated, staring at screens filled with revised projections and corrected assumptions. The atmosphere felt completely different from the conference Daniel Harper attended only days earlier. Back then, confidence had filled every corner of the room. Now something else had taken its place. Reflection, reality, humility. Daniel quietly gathered his laptop and notes. His role in the process was finished. The numbers could now speak for themselves. As he prepared to leave, the board chairman approached him. Several executives followed. "Mr. Harper," the chairman said, extending his hand. "On behalf of the board, thank you." Daniel shook his hand politely. "I am glad the issue was identified." The chairman smiled faintly. "You identified it." Daniel nodded. "The important thing is that it gets fixed." Several people exchanged looks. That answer somehow impressed them more than the discovery itself. Most professionals would have taken a victory lap. Most would have reminded everyone that they had been ignored. Daniel seemed entirely uninterested in either. Meanwhile, across the room, Victoria Grant remained seated at the conference table. The revised figures still glowed on the screen before her. $600 million. The number was difficult to ignore. Yet what occupied her thoughts most was not the error. It was the memory of the original presentation. The challenge. The laughter. The certainty. She replayed the moment repeatedly. Daniel had never argued. Never raised his voice. Never tried to embarrass anyone. He simply followed the evidence wherever it led. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. Before Daniel could leave, Victoria finally stood and crossed the room. The remaining conversations gradually quieted. People noticed immediately. She stopped a few feet away from him. "Do you have a minute?" Daniel smiled politely. "Of course." For a moment, Victoria seemed unsure how to begin. The room waited. Then she spoke. "I owe you an apology." Complete silence followed. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Victoria continued. "At the presentation, I assumed confidence meant certainty." She shook her head slightly. "I was wrong." Daniel listened quietly. "You raised a legitimate concern. I dismissed it." She looked directly at him. "And when you tried to warn us afterward, we dismissed it again." The honesty surprised everyone. Daniel smiled gently. "The important thing is that you listened before it was too late." Victoria laughed softly. "That sounds much kinder than we deserve." A few people smiled. Others lowered their eyes. Daniel's response carried no bitterness. No scorekeeping. No desire to make anyone uncomfortable. The room felt strangely still. One executive finally spoke. "How did you see it?" Daniel glanced toward the screen. "I did not see anything special." Several people looked confused. He continued. "I simply kept asking whether the assumption matched reality." Another executive shook his head. "Thousands of people reviewed those numbers." Daniel smiled. Sometimes when many people review something, everyone assumes someone else already checked it. A few quiet laughs followed. Not because the observation was amusing, because it was painfully true. Later that evening, Daniel left the city and drove home beneath a sky painted with shades of orange and gold. Traffic moved steadily along the highway. The radio played softly in the background. For the first time in days, his thoughts felt quiet. The burden of uncertainty had disappeared. The truth was no longer hidden. It belonged to everyone now. When he arrived home, Emma was waiting on the front porch. She stood immediately when she saw his truck. "Well," Daniel stepped out and smiled. "They found it." Emma grinned. "You mean you found it?" Daniel laughed. "They verified it." Emma followed him toward the house. Was everyone shocked? Daniel considered the question. More thoughtful than shocked. Emma narrowed her eyes. "That sounds like a dad answer." Daniel laughed again. Inside the kitchen, they prepared dinner together while evening settled around the neighborhood. For a while they talked about school, friends, and ordinary things. Eventually Emma looked up from the table. "Are people finally going to respect you now?" Daniel paused. The question lingered between them. Then he smiled. "Respect is nice." Emma waited. Daniel placed 2 plates on the table. "But I would rather people respect the truth." Emma thought about that for several seconds before nodding slowly. Outside, the last sunlight faded beyond the horizon. Inside the house, peace returned. Yet across the city, inside boardrooms and executive offices, one fact continued spreading from person to person. The single father everyone underestimated had seen what an entire room of experts missed. And the silence that followed that realization was far louder than any applause could ever be. The story should have ended there. The calculations had been corrected. The board had acknowledged the mistake. The risk had been identified before becoming a disaster. Yet over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. People began asking a different question. Not how Daniel Harper found the error, but who Daniel Harper really was. Articles appeared in financial publications discussing the review. Industry newsletters referenced the corrected projections. Professional forums debated how such a significant assumption could survive so many layers of analysis. Again and again, one detail kept appearing. A single independent consultant had identified what entire teams missed. The attention spread quickly through business circles. Daniel noticed almost none of it. He was too busy helping Emma prepare for her science competition. One evening, they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by notebooks, diagrams, and half-finished project materials. Emma pointed toward a model she had built. "Do you think this will work?" Daniel studied it carefully. "Maybe." Emma laughed. "You always say maybe." Daniel smiled. "That is because certainty is expensive." Emma rolled her eyes. "That definitely sounds like something you would say." The phone rang before he could answer. Daniel glanced at the screen. The caller was Victoria Grant. He answered politely. "Good evening." Victoria sounded different than before. Less formal. More thoughtful. "I hope I am not interrupting." Daniel looked at Emma, who was currently attempting to attach a component upside down. Only a future scientific breakthrough. Emma laughed from across the table. Victoria smiled through the phone. "Then I will be brief." A short silence followed. Then she spoke carefully. The board completed its final review. Daniel listened. The corrected exposure estimate was even larger than we originally believed. He closed his eyes briefly. "I was afraid of that. You saved us from making a very expensive mistake." Daniel remained quiet. Victoria continued. "I realized something during the review process." "What is that?" Another pause. Everyone in that room was focused on being right. Her voice softened slightly. "You were focused on finding the truth." The words lingered between them. Daniel finally smiled. "There is a difference. A very large difference." After the call ended, Emma looked up immediately. "Was that the CEO?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Emma grinned. "The same CEO?" "The same one. The one who challenged you." Daniel laughed softly. "Emma." She shrugged. "Just checking." The following weekend, Daniel attended Emma's science competition at her school. The gymnasium buzzed with activity. Students proudly presented projects while parents moved from table to table offering encouragement. Daniel stood beside Emma's display, helping only when asked. Mostly he watched. Mostly he listened. Watching her explain ideas with confidence brought him more satisfaction than any professional recognition ever could. Midway through the event, a familiar voice called his name. Daniel turned and saw Victoria walking across the gymnasium. Several teachers recognized her immediately. Emma looked surprised. "What is she doing here?" Victoria smiled as she approached. "I was invited to sponsor the STEM scholarship program." Then she looked at Emma's project. "And I wanted to see the scientist your father keeps talking about." Emma's face brightened instantly. The three spent several minutes discussing the project. Victoria listened carefully while Emma explained every detail. When she finished, Victoria nodded approvingly. "Your father must be very proud." Emma glanced toward Daniel. "I think so." Daniel smiled. "Very." For a moment, all three stood quietly together. The atmosphere felt different from every previous interaction. The challenge was gone. The assumptions were gone. What remained was respect. Genuine respect. Later that afternoon, as the competition ended and families began leaving, Victoria stopped beside Daniel near the parking lot. "Can I tell you something?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "Of course." Victoria looked toward the school building. The $600 million mistake was not the biggest lesson. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "No." She shook her head. "The biggest lesson was discovering how easy it is to overlook someone simply because they do not demand attention." Daniel looked across the parking lot where Emma was laughing with friends. Then he smiled. "Most valuable things are easy to overlook at first." Victoria followed his gaze. This time, she understood exactly what he meant. And for the first time since this entire journey began, the story was no longer about a financial error. It was about the quiet truth hidden beneath every assumption people make about one another. Several months later, the headlines had faded. Financial publications moved on to newer stories. Markets shifted their attention elsewhere. The boardroom discussions became archived reports. The corrected projections became standard practice. Life, as it always does, continued forward. Yet some things remained. The company recovered. Better safeguards were introduced. New review procedures were implemented. Investors avoided losses that once seemed unavoidable. And somewhere inside countless spreadsheets, presentations, and executive meetings, one lesson quietly survived. Never assume certainty is the same as truth. For Daniel Harper, However, the most meaningful changes happened far away from boardrooms. They happened at home. They happened in ordinary moments. On a cool autumn evening, he sat in the front row of a school auditorium watching Emma receive recognition for her science project. The audience applauded warmly as students crossed the stage one by one. Daniel smiled from his seat. The applause sounded wonderful. Not because it celebrated achievement, because it celebrated effort. Emma spotted him in the crowd and waved. Daniel waved back. In that moment, nothing about financial models or executive meetings seemed important. After the ceremony ended, parents and students gathered in the lobby. Laughter filled the building. Proud families posed for photographs. Emma walked toward him holding a certificate beneath one arm. "What do you think?" she asked. Daniel looked at the certificate and smiled. "I think hard work looks good on you." Emma laughed. "That sounds like something you practiced." It was completely spontaneous. Sure it was. They walked toward the parking lot together. The evening air felt crisp. Leaves drifted across the sidewalk. For a few minutes, they simply enjoyed the quiet. Then Emma glanced up at him. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel nodded. "Always." She thought carefully before speaking. "When everyone doubted you, did it ever make you want to prove them wrong?" Daniel smiled softly. It was a question only Emma would ask. Honest, thoughtful, important. He looked toward the fading sunset before answering. "Not really." Emma looked surprised. "Why not?" Daniel placed his hands in his jacket pockets. "Because proving people wrong rarely changes anything important." She considered that. "Then what does?" Daniel looked at her. "Helping people see the truth." They continued walking. The answer stayed with Emma. It stayed because she knew it was true. Her father never chased applause. He never chased recognition. He never measured success by how many people admired him. He measured it by whether he acted with integrity when nobody was watching. That was why the story mattered. Not because he found a mistake worth $600 million. Not because executives eventually listened. Not because a CEO apologized. Those things were memorable. But they were not the heart of the story. The heart of the story was much quieter. It was a father choosing patience instead of pride. Humility instead of ego. Truth instead of attention. Several weeks later, Victoria Grant attended a community education event sponsored by her company. During her remarks, she spoke about leadership, accountability, and learning from mistakes. Near the end, someone in the audience asked what the most valuable lesson of her career had been. The room waited. Victoria smiled. Then she answered without hesitation. The most valuable lesson was learning that wisdom does not always arrive wearing a title. The audience grew silent. Victoria continued. Sometimes the person with the most important insight is the person nobody notices. Many people nodded. Few understood the full story behind the answer. That was fine. The lesson remained true regardless. And so, as seasons changed and life moved forward, Daniel Harper returned to the rhythm he loved most. Morning coffee, school drop-offs, client meetings, family dinners, ordinary days. The kind of days that rarely appear in headlines, but somehow matter the most. The single father who had been challenged in front of an entire room never needed revenge. He never needed humiliation to change sides. He never needed applause to validate his worth. The truth did that quietly all by itself. And perhaps that is why the ending felt so powerful. Because real dignity rarely announces itself. It simply stands patiently beside the truth until everyone else catches up. If this story reminded you of someone who chose integrity over recognition, someone whose quiet strength changed lives without demanding attention, share that thought in the comments. And if stories about character, humility, and second chances mean something to you, we would be honored to have you join us again for another journey.